So a very interesting shir tonight. I'm very excited. A lot of it is going to be based on something I saw from a sefer by Rabbi Moshe Schwerd. He's a rabbi in Queens. So I'll be sharing a little bit some of the sources that he brought. So we're going to talk tonight about Rachel Imenu. So Rachel Imenu, Rachel from the Torah, has some incredible personality traits that we can really learn a lot from. And hopefully I'll present some of them and maybe talk about how we can emulate them and bring them into our own lives. So first, a little background. So everyone knows the story from Chumash that what happened to Rachel Imenu, Yaakov Avinu sees her for the first time, and instantly he, falls proverbially head over heels in love for her, and he agrees to work for her father, Lavan, for 7 years to win her hand in marriage. And of course, Lavan is a very cunning businessman. And the night of the wedding, he ends up tricking Rachel he ends up tricking Yaakov and giving him Leah as opposed to Rachel. Right? So everyone knows this story. So perhaps let's just zoom out a little bit and then we'll come back in. So it could be some people know this, it could be it's a known thing, but really originally, the way things were supposed to be, had things gone the way they're supposed to, is that Yaakov was going to marry just Rachel, and really Leah was meant for Esav. That was how it was supposed to be originally. Now, Esav, we saw, sort of didn't grow up exactly the way he was supposed to. He went off the derech, and he ended up losing out on that potential shidduch. And Chazal tell us what happened was that Leah davened very, very hard. She prayed with a lot of strength in order to be saved from having to marry Esav. She desperately wanted to marry Yaakov, not Esav. And really her prayers, it says, worked. So what ended up happening? Before the night of the wedding, Yaakov had agreed with Rachel on a certain simanim, signs, that she would give him to be sure that it was really Rachel. And Rachel knew that if it would end up being that Leah would get into the yichud room with Yaakov and not have the simanim, it would be very embarrassing for Leah. So to spare her this embarrassment, Rachel gave the simanim, these signs, to her sister Leah in a legendary act of self-sacrifice. She didn't know that she was going to be able to eventually marry Yaakov. She didn't know necessarily that would happen. And even if she would now just be a second wife. Yet in a act of self-sacrifice, she was willing to do this for her sister so as to spare her from incredible embarrassment. So that's the story of, at least in the Chumash, the story of Rachel and Leah and the marriage to Yaakov. Now, Chazal tell us also, or really Chumash tells us, that when Rachel Imenu was to pass away, says she was in childbirth with Binyamin, and it said that the Chumash says that childbirth was very difficult, and she took some comfort from the fact that Binyamin, a second son, was born to her, but eventually she ended up succumbing to that childbirth, and she passed away. And the Chumash says that she was buried on the road. That's where Yaakov Avinu buried her, near a place called Beis Lechem, but it was on the derech, on the road. So Chazal talk exactly why was she buried here. To make the question better, all the avos and the imahos were all buried together in Maras Machpelah. Maybe some of the listeners have been there. I've had the merit to be there. In fact, by Maras Machpelah, the burial place of all the avos. What is that? A long time ago. Okay, well, everyone should definitely, if they haven't yet, to try to make the effort at some point to get to go there. So in Maras Machpelah, that's where all the avos and the imahus, said even Adam and Chava are buried in, Adam and Eve are buried in Maras Machpelah. My wife was telling me over something very interesting about Maras Machpelah. She listened to a shir about it last night, that Avram Avinu specifically wanted Maras Machpelah because, interestingly enough, he had found it, and he went down into it, and he saw a great, amazing light in Maras Machpelah, and he realized it was actually Adam HaRishon. Chazal say that Adam HaRishon's heel was, we can't really understand this, was brighter than the sun. So this is one of the reasons why Avraham Avinu wanted to have himself and others, his wife Sarah, be buried in Maras Machpelah. But Rachel Imenu, we see, wasn't buried there. She was buried on the road, which seems to be a very strange place for a burial. So, of course, with everything in the Chumash, Chazal enlighten us as to what's going on in this story. Why was she buried on the road? So it could be, it's a famous Chazal. So again, the verse in the Torah says, V'tamas Rachel passed away, V'tikvar b'derech Ephras. And she was buried on the way toward Ephrat. So Chazal say, this is in Bereshis Rabbah, Ma ra'u avinu Yaakov likvor es Rachel b'derech Ephras. What did our father Yaakov Avinu see that he buried Rachel on this road towards Ephrat? Ela tzafa Yaakov Avinu shehagolios atidus la'avur sham. Yaakov Avinu saw that in the future, when our ancestors would go into Gullus, into the diaspora as we're living in today, they would pass by, this is really during the first Gullus, they would pass by this place, Ephrat, on this road to Ephrat, they would pass by there on the way towards Gullus. Lefikach kavra sham. And that's why Yaakov Avinu buried her there. What did that accomplish? Kedei shetehe mivakeshes alehem rachamin. In order that Rachel, as only a mother could do, would be able to request compassion upon her children as they went into Gullus. Hadahu diksiv, this is what's written. It's a pasuk in Yirmiyah. Kol birama nishma. There's a voice in the heights being heard. Nihi bechi tamrurim Rachel mavache al baneha. Rachel is crying about her children. So only as a mother could, Rachel sees her children going into Gullus during the times after the destruction of the first Beis HaMikdash, and Rachel is able to daven for the Jewish people who are all her children. So Yaakov Avinu saw this in his Ruach HaKodesh with his extra sense, and he knew that this is the right place for Rachel to be buried. So that's one Chazal that talks about Rachel's incredible power of prayer, how Yaakov Avinu saw it fitting to bury her there. So I'm going to present perhaps a few more Chazals, a few more statements from our sages that show this power of her prayer. And then perhaps we'll go and speak about some of the outstanding traits of Rachel Imenu that gave her this special koach of tefillah, this power of prayer. So another Chazal, it says that after Rachel Imenu passed away and was buried, Yosef HaTzadik, her first son, came and he said to Yaakov Avinu, if it's okay with my father, I want to bury my mother in a more honorable place. Maybe I can bring her, I'll do all the heavy lifting, and I'll bring her to Maras Machpelah. And she'll be able to be with, my grandmother, grandfather, etc. And that'll be much more honorable for a wonderful tzaddikus like my mother, that she should be buried in a more honorable place. That's what Yosef HaTzadik requested. As an aside, we see oftentimes Yosef was involved in the kavod of his mother. That was something that Yosef was very known for. For instance, when Yaakov Avinu was sending a tribute to Esav, and then all of the family of Yaakov Avinu passed in front of Esav, it says the last people to pass in front of him was Rachel and Yosef. And it said Yosef actually went in front of his mother, Rachel, in order that he should keep his mother hidden from Esav. So you see, this is something that Yosef was involved in a lot, was the honor of his mother. It's important something for children to be able to give honor to their parents. But something that we see Yosef was actually excelled in. So anyway, so Yosef Tzaddik makes this request to Yaakov Avinu. And what does Yaakov Avinu tell him? He says, no, I can't do that. I can't allow you to move her because Hashem didn't let me bury her there. Kaviyachol, God made it that I have to bury her here, and Hashem, they're not allowing me in heaven to be able to bury Rachel there in Maras Machpelah. She has to be buried here. So we see from this Chazal that it's not just a coincidence that Rachel was buried here. It's actually the plan from heaven. It was God's plan that Rachel should be buried on this road towards Ephrat. So there's another example. One more Chazal. There's a similar Chazal to Rashi, really, in the Sefer Yirmiyah. I quoted the pasuk in Yirmiyah that it says, Rachel is crying over her children. So Chazal actually present the back and forth. What exactly did Rachel say when she was davening for her children in front of Hashem? Right? Imagine, it's a very big responsibility. She's here in charge of, she's responsible for saving the Jewish people in a certain sense. So it says Hashem, during the first Gullus, and really this is a paradigm even for the Gullus we're in nowadays too, Kaviyachol, Hashem had a certain option, if you will. He had in his mind, perhaps, to just keep Klal Yisrael in Gullus forever, Lo Aleinu, to never allow us to return back to the land, back to Israel. He had that in mind. Why? So it says that one of the things that the Jewish people did that caused Gullus to happen, that caused us to go into exile, one of the things was that the Jewish people put an idol into the Kodesh HaKadoshim, the Beis HaMikdash. And Hashem obviously became very, very angry, which we have to know what that means. Obviously, Hashem getting angry, these are all sort of theological things that have to be dealt with, but just on a simple level for now, Hashem got very angry over this terrible affront to his honor. And the sages tell exactly what happened. As the Jewish people were leaving to go into Gullus, to go into exile, they requested from each of our ancestors, Avram, Yitzchak, Yaakov, Sarah, Rivka, Leah, to daven on their behalf. Avraham came with all of his merits, his incredible chesed, but Hashem, Kaviyachol, didn't accept his prayers. Yitzchak Avinu, as with the merit of the Akedah, that he was willing to sacrifice himself, and somehow even that wasn't enough of a merit in this context. And so on, all Yaakov and then Sarah, Rivka, and Leah, they all came forward in front of Hashem to plead the case of the Jewish people. But none of the prayers went through. Again, this is a famous medrash. I'm sure everyone is aware of this. But just to speak it out a little more. Finally, it says, Rachel came. And Rachel didn't just say, Hashem save them and plead for Rachmanis. Like a good lawyer, she had a very strong claim. What was her claim? She said, Hashem, I can tell you're very upset. Because what happened? The Jewish people brought Kaviyachol, an idol, into this relationship. What's called in Hebrew, it's called a tsara. When a husband has a wife and he marries a second wife, the wives are referred to as each other's tsaras, which means, in a sense, the competing wife, the enemy wife. That's what it means. Again, on a deraisa level, men were allowed to marry two women, and then, like we see, Yaakov Avinu married two women. He married Leah and he married Rachel. So that's what it's called, a tsara. So Hashem was very upset that the Jewish people, Kaviyachol, brought a tsara, an enemy relationship, into their relationship with Hashem by bringing an idol into the Beis HaMikdash, a terrible, terrible sin. So Rachel had a very strong case, because what did she say? Hashem, you're upset that the Jewish people brought this other entity into the relationship. But look at me, Hashem. I was supposed to marry Yaakov. I was supposed to be his lone wife. And yet I was willing to sacrifice that relationship and bring a tsara, bring an enemy wife, my sister, into that relationship. So surely, Hashem, my compassion is nowhere near the level of your compassion. And if I was able to bring a tsara, an enemy wife, into my relationship and not be upset, so too, Hashem, you should forgive the Jewish people for this affront to your honor. And it says, out of all of the avos and all the imahos, this one tefillah of Rachel, who made a very, very strong claim, it seems, was the claim that was accepted at the end of the day. And that's what saved the Jewish people and made it that our gullus isn't going to last forever. One day Hashem is going to bring us back. He's going to bring Mashiach, and he's going to bring us back to the land of Israel. All in the merit of this prayer of Rachel Imenu. So we see the incredible power of the prayer of Rachel Imenu. And we see even her using a taina, what's called a claim like a lawyer would use. Yet, certainly prayer is predicated on a person's midos. If a person doesn't have good midos, then their prayers aren't all that worthwhile. Of course, every prayer is worthwhile. But a person's midos, a person's characteristics, the way they interact with people, the politeness, the care they show others, that's ultimately what's going to give a prayer its power. So perhaps we can speak a little bit about Rachel Imenu's characteristics. So there's a very interesting chazal to start off with in Maseches Megillah. So the Maseches Megillah deals with the halachas and the stories of Purim. The first parak in Maseches Megillah talks and darshans, it speaks out a lot of the details of the Purim story. So I'll read a little bit of it, and I'll speak the story out. So there's a pasuk. It says, Lo yigra mitzadik einov. Hashem does not withdraw his eyes from a righteous person. The pasuk is saying that Hashem always has his eyes on righteous people, on the tzaddikim. What does that mean? So the explanation of this is that when a tzaddik, a righteous person, does a good deed, Hashem makes sure that he's compensated for that. So it says that as compensation for Rachel Imenu's modesty, it focuses on her modesty, on her tznius. It says that as a merit of her tznius, she merited to have Shaul HaMelech, King Shaul, as her descendant, who also exhibited this midah of tznius. How so? Because when he was anointed king, he was told by Shmuel HaNavi not to tell anybody. That was what he was told. And he was able to keep that to himself. And it says, as a reward for Shaul Hamelech's modesty, his tznius, he merited another descendant. He merited Esther. Esther was from the tribe of Benjamin, as Shaul was. Shaul was the ancestor of Esther Hamalka, who it also says exhibited incredible tznius. What was Esther's tznius? Her modesty was that when Achashverosh first took Esther to the palace, he had a certain obsession with Esther. It was very interesting. He was obsessed with Esther. She was very beautiful, of course, but he was absolutely obsessed with Esther. And part of the source of his obsession was that there was a mystery around Esther. He did not know which people she came from. He didn't know. He was assured that she came from royal lineage, which she was. She was descended from Shaul HaMelech. But he didn't know of which nation she came from. And it says in the Gemara, the Talmud in Megillah, that Achashverosh went through many different plans to try to get her to reveal this information to him. He tried bringing other people into to make her jealous. He tried all different things. And at the end of the day, until the very end of the Purim story, she would not reveal this information to Achashverosh. So we see this as a sign of Esther's tznius, which was an inheritance from Shaul, and ultimately an inheritance from Rachel Imenu. So we see one of Rachel Imenu's very strong characteristics was her tznius. Which needs to be explored a little bit. What exactly was her great tznius? Surely we see from the story of her giving over the signs to her sister Leah a strong, maybe that she excelled in the midah of empathy, compassion, sympathy. Ve'ahavta re'echa kamoicha. But where do you see in that midah, where do you see in that story the midah of modesty? Does anyone want to think about that for a moment? You have an idea, Gary?
No, I'm just trying to think.
Where do you see it? It seemingly isn't the meaning. I wouldn't pull out from there necessarily her aspect of modesty. I would say she's very compassionate. Has a lot of empathy. She cares so much for her sister. She is real ve'ahavta l'recha kamoicha. But modesty, it seems to be out of place. Now, all of the Mefarshim, all of the commentaries on this Gemara are bothered by this. So I'll maybe tell you one answer, and then I'll get to what I want to say and relate it back to maybe what we've been speaking about. So the Ben Yehoyada, who's the Ben Ishchai from Baghdad, an incredible tzaddik who wrote a lot of Perushim on the Torah. He has a whole commentary on the stories of the Talmud. So he deals with this question. And he says something very interesting that surely brings out the modesty of Rachel Imenu on a very simple level. He says, how could it be that Yaakov Avinu could make a mistake about which woman he was marrying? If it would be that he saw her even a couple times, he would know the difference between Rachel and Leah, even if it was dark. People can very easily see the difference between a person's face, different height, different width, all the different things. He said, so the Ben Yehoyada, the Ben Ishchai says, rather what happened? It must be that Rachel hid herself from Yaakov all those years, for 7 years. He never actually saw her. Maybe he saw her once when they first met, but since then, he didn't actually see her. And he says that was her great tznius. This is what the Ben Ishchai says. So, I'll bring in one more chazal, just to give it context a little bit, and then maybe I'll say another mahalach, another path in understanding the chazal. And maybe you'll give us some insight into what the great merit of Rachel, what her incredible midos were. just to compare perhaps, Chazal say, there's a medrash, that it picks up on the unique midah of Rachel versus Leah, really based on their descendants. Leah, it says, who are her descendants? Yehuda, Ruvain, David HaMelech was one of the descendants of of Leah, right, from the tribe of Yehuda. So Yehuda, what's one of the famous stories of Yehuda? Yehuda and Tamar. Yehuda, on a certain level, and maybe it was a sin, maybe it wasn't, I'm not going to get involved in that, but Yehuda had maybe a certain lapse in his level, on his level, where he ended up having a relationship with Tamar, unbeknownst to him. And there's a whole story that went in the Chumash, but he ended up admitting, doing hodah, admitting, being modeh on what he did in front of everybody in public. He was really going to put Tamar to death because he found out she was pregnant. So it must be that she was with somebody when she wasn't supposed to. And once Yehuda realized that it was him, because she sent simanim to him, she sent certain signs to him that it was known that Yehuda was the one she was pregnant from. At that point, Yehuda admitted in public that really it was him, and she's more righteous than me. That's essentially what Yehuda said. David HaMelech too had this midah of being modeh. We see by the sin, not a sin. It says that David HaMelech didn't sin, but in a certain sense, it was maybe a lapse from his, perhaps the level that he should have been on when he was with Bathsheba. So we see that the descendants of Leah had this midah of hodah, of admission. The descendants of Rachel, on the other hand, as I just went through, Shaul and Esther, were known for their shtika, their quietness, their being silent. And Chazal take these two midos, these two traits, silence and admission, being modeh, those two traits, they take them as paradigms in Avodas Hashem. So perhaps with these midrashim that bring out not just Rachel's modesty, but also her silence, that those two things go together, maybe we can understand what it means, Rachel Imenu's modesty. How was she? What was her modesty? So Rav Chaim Friedlander, he wrote a sefer called Sifsei Chaim. It's one of the famous, he was from Bnei Brak. He was one of the mashkiach, basically, of Panovich Yeshiva, one of the famed yeshivas in Israel. The way he explains the midah of tznius is that tznius is that a person puts his ego, in Hebrew his anoichi, his ego, to allow that to sort of take a back seat. And the understanding that I have of this, which I've seen elsewhere, there's a shmuz from Rav Nassan Wachtvogel, who was the mashkiach in Lakewood. He explains modesty is that modesty can only exist when I have an inner life. I have something of value inside of me, and I have something of value to the extent that it's worth guarding. I have something inside of me, traits and perhaps desires, ritzonos, to do the right thing, a neshama inside of me. And when I'm modest, when I keep myself quiet, I don't try to make myself the center of attention, I guard that valuable thing. The same way a person, if he has a jewel, he keeps that jewel hidden. He doesn't flaunt it in the middle of Times Square, that would be a terrible thing to do. So, in the same sense is tznius. Tznius isn't just about how a person dresses or the type of language and clothing and things like that he wears. Tznius is mainly about the insides of a person, and tznius is to guard what's inside of him. Now, Rachel, when she was about to make this incredible sacrifice of a marriage, she was going to be the lone wife of Yaakov Avinu, an incredible honor, an incredible privilege to marry the greatest tzaddik in the world and be the mother of the Jewish people. What gave her that strength to put her sister before herself and to make that ultimate sacrifice? That she would go from being one of the most important people in all of world history to maybe not being anybody. How was she able to do that? So I think the answer lies in this midah of tznius. Because the midah of tznius shows us, when a person has that midah of tznius, there's something very valuable inside of that person. And when they're tsunua, they're quiet. They don't flaunt what they have. Then they show that they have this value inside of them, that they hold an inner sense of worth. So Rachel, who shows through her descendants, through Shaul, through Esther, the great midah of shtika and tznius, shows that her main avoda was this inner life, this inner world, this inner value that she had inside of her. That was her special midah. Meaning the midah of tznius isn't the external presentation to the world. The external presentation to the world that in a certain sense, you're actually not presenting yourself so much to the external world, but it's serving the inner world. That's what tznius is. So Rachel had that, and that was her special trait. And that's what gave her that very strong will, that strength of character to be able to sacrifice everything. Because a person who doesn't have that strong sense of self, that strong sense of self-value, as soon as you say that you're not going to be a somebody on the world stage in world history, then life's not worth living. But for Rachel, that wasn't the case. She said, okay, even if I don't have the husband of my dreams, but I have a big inner world inside of myself. I have a whole inner world. I have a relationship with Hashem. I have a neshama. Just because my external life may not turn out exactly the way I might have envisioned, but that doesn't really affect me because my main life is inside of myself. My connection to Hashem, the health of my neshama. So that's what gave Rachel that inner strength to make this incredible decision. So now perhaps we can come back and talk about the strength of Rachel's tefillas. Again, aside from the medrash that I shared where she had this very, very strong taina, this very strong claim, kaviyachol, on HaKadosh Baruch Hu, on Hashem, but what gave her this special koach of tefillah? So what's tefillah? Tefillah really on a deeper level is building a relationship with Hashem. That a person speaks to Hashem the way they would speak to their father on a simple level. Obviously there's levels and levels and levels of tefillah. But when a person has a strong inner connection to Hashem, then they can speak to Hashem like one who speaks to their close relative, to a grandfather, or to a grandmother, to a mother, to a father. They can speak to Hashem in the same natural way they can speak to a friend. So Rachel Imenu, who built up her inner life, her inner connection to Hashem, through her tznius, through guarding herself, through guarding that, what we'd maybe call the pintal yid inside of her, she merited that her prayers should be so powerful. And that perhaps is the lesson of Rachel Imenu. So for us, in our own lives, whether we're davening or we're learning Torah, whatever we're doing, should realize that we have an inner value, an inner strength, that there's an inner world we can build through tefillah, through learning Torah more in depth, And when you learn Torah, you discover more about yourself, you discover more about Hashem, you discover more about the tzaddikim, and that builds an inner world. It says about certain Torah scholars, the Sfarim talk about Torah scholars, that when they delve into a topic, it's as if they're going from room to room in a palace. Torah is compared to a palace, and when you go from one subject to another subject in Torah, whether it's a simple shot of the halacha, or you're talking about more esoteric things in Torah, the Torah is compared almost to like a palace. You're going from room to room in a palace. So when a person builds up that inner life through Torah and through tefillah, through speaking to Hashem, then he'll have that ability when the time is required to be able to talk and daven to Hashem about perhaps the very serious things that happen in Klal Yisrael. It's no secret that Klal Yisrael right now is living through a very dangerous time, and there's a lot of suffering going on in Klal Yisrael, lo aleinu. There are still people in Gaza and people fighting the wars, and each of us should feel, even though we may think of ourselves maybe as, just another person, just, one Jew out of, many millions of people, but we should realize that because of who we are, because we're Jews, we have a special koach of tefillah, especially when we work on it and we value our tefillah, especially when we value the interconnection that we have to Hashem. And we should, just like Rachel did, even though Rachel was praised for her silence, but when the Jewish people needed her, she was there to call out and plead for the Jewish people. She had that compassion on her children. So we should follow in the footsteps of Rachel Imenu, and in the same way, feel compassion for the Jewish people, who many of whom are really going through a very difficult time, especially in Israel, even in America. People are going through difficulties with anti-Semitism and other things. We should realize that we have the power through tefillah and through the mitzvahs that we do to be a protection and a merit for our brothers and sisters all over the world. And if we build up that interconnection to Hashem, our prayers will be very, very powerful. I forgot to mention at the beginning of this year, the reason why I decided to speak about Rachel Imenu. I realized I didn't mention why. The reason is because last Monday, in fact, Monday night, was actually Rachel Imenu's yahrzeit. It was a very special day on the Jewish calendar, Yud Aleph Cheshvan. And in general, Cheshvan is called Mar Cheshvan. That's the month that we're in right now. And really the only event that takes place in Cheshvan, actually, besides for my anniversary, but the main event that takes place in Cheshvan is actually Rachel Imenu's yahrzeit. So in that sense, it's called Mar Cheshvan, bitter Cheshvan. I just wanted to mention that was why I decided tonight to speak about Rachel Imenu. And in the merit of talking about Rachel Imenu, we should all merit to grow in our midah of tznius, in our koach, our power of davening, and hopefully all together we can, bring Klal Yisrael closer to the Geula Shlema. It should be speedily and soon. Thank you everybody for tuning in. If anyone has any questions,